Live now, and I told everyone not to follow me on Twitter. But if you're interested, all bone, no brain at Ginger Radio. All right. So I think now we're live. Hello, everybody from Indianapolis, Indiana, coming to you live, probably from your bedroom, office, dining room, or if you're like me, your couch. Welcome to the Indiana Sciences Day for Science event. Yay! My name's Allison. I will be your host, your MC, your guide through the scientific expertise that Indianapolis has to offer. And before we get into some of our fantastic speakers today, Indiana Sciences has a few housekeeping highlights. We'll call them highlights. Books, Booze, and Brains. If you're not familiar, this is the Indiana Sciences Book Club, which, of course, now due to COVID-19 is virtual. So you can all join in. You don't have to be in Indianapolis to have a good time. 6:30 p.m. on the Indiana Sciences Facebook page, broadcast live. We share a book, share your favorite brew, whether that be a cider or beer, or if you're like me, a good wine. And you'll chat with some local scientists about a science-themed book. It's a great time, a lot of fun, and a great way to connect during this virtual time. I'd also like to give a huge shout out not only to Indiana Sciences for hosting this Day for Science event, but specifically Rufus. Rufus, you're out there, you're listening. Everybody here thanks you. You put so much work into this event, and you are the GOAT. And as I said, we're not talking cheese. We're not talking goat cheese. You are the greatest. And also a big shout out to the Central Indiana Science Outreach Team for helping make this happen. And just a quick reminder, Indiana Sciences includes all of the awesome Central Indiana Science Outreach people. This is 100% volunteer run. We're a nonprofit and all of our events are always free to the public. And that's even easier now that we're broadcasting online. If you want to help us and all the awesome science communicators here in Indianapolis, and you want some PPE that shows that you really understand why masks are so important, consider grabbing one of the Science Saves masks, which you can find at our website, indianasciences.org/merch. And if you're not accepting packages and you have hermetically sealed your house up, you can also just donate, indianasciences.org/give, to keep this rolling into 21 and the future. And just a quick preface that the thoughts and opinions shared during this event today are representing that of the individuals presenting and do not reflect on any private or public entity they may be affiliated with. We are a group of science-minded people. We are passionate about informing people about the importance of science in the policy process. So let's get into it. Unless you've been fortunate enough to maybe live in a cabin 1,000 miles away with no access to Wi-Fi over the last 10 months, you probably know that 2020 has been quite the year, ups and downs and just kind of all around insanity. COVID-19 has ravaged the United States and science has been criticized and undermined from expected and some unexpected sources. But the science itself really hasn't changed, just how we perceive it and how we're communicating and sharing it. Here today, we're gonna add our voices to this sound chamber happening online in hopes of dispelling some myths, teaching some new tricks, maybe a couple treats, and bringing to light the great science and database policies that are happening, you know, both here in Indiana and on a federal level. Bringing to light, you know, on why, gaining some insight on why people do the things we do. And really our most important take-home message, if you click off right now, just wait, give me 3 seconds. Go vote. We want you to vote. Early voting is already happening. I submitted my absentee ballot. Do the thing. And if you're here in Indianapolis, you might have already noticed that the city-county building lines aren't really that long. And here in Marion County, there will be 5 more early voting locations opening up around the city, open 7 days a week, starting this Saturday, October 24th until November 1st. If you're a registered voter here in Indiana, you can vote at any early polling location. So you don't have to find which one is for your area. No, go to any of them. This is for Marion County, Indianapolis, but you can visit vote.indy.gov for more information. You can also visit indianavoters.in.gov to see what will be on your ballot so you can go to the voting booth empowered and well-informed. Okay. Let's get to our star-studded lineup. I'm so excited. So our first speaker will be Nipun Chopra. He's an assistant professor of biology at DePaul University. His PhD and postdoctoral training were completed here in Indianapolis at the IU School of Medicine, where he focused on microRNAs that regulate neurodegenerative disorders. And he loves to include that he is his mother's 3rd favorite son, but you are our first speaker. And he will be discussing and dispelling some of the COVID myths, the human impact of pandemic policy. Nipun, take it away.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everyone that's watching. And thank you to the Central Indiana Science Association for setting this up. This is fantastic from Indiana Scientists to get this going for us. So my name is Nipun Chopra, as Allison mentioned. I'm an assistant professor of biology at DePaul University. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the policies that we are currently, that have contributed to our current pandemic. So the title of my my talk is COVID-19, a failure of hard and soft policy. So right off the bat, I want to define what I mean by hard and soft policy to you. For me, a hard policy is one which is government mandated. For example, a governor telling us that a lockdown is occurring or you're lifting a lockdown. That's a hard policy. Whereas a soft policy is a non-stated policy that is just widely accepted, that is just understood. And I think we've had a combination of both things. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. I want to start with showing you this very simple graph that's basically showing us that ever since the start of the pandemic, we have essentially seen a continuous rise and no flattening of the curve. This is, of course, cumulative cases right here, but we're not really seeing a deceleration in any way, which is problematic. So the first failure I want to tell you about is a failure that precedes the pandemic, and that is how our healthcare is set up. And Professor Carlotta Berry, I'm sure she'll talk about this in some more detail in her talk on anti-racist policies. But essentially, we exist in a system where approximately 1/10 of the people in Marion County do not have health insurance. This is because of a variety of systemic failures that have disproportionately affected folks in the Latinx and Black communities. And in fact, we are to this point where it is widely accepted that this pandemic has had a disproportionate effect on people in those communities, not due to any reasons other than systemic problems in healthcare, systemic racism, and even issues of implicit bias in the healthcare system in itself. Another issue that we've run into is that for some reason, we have decided to focus the pandemic, the efforts of the pandemic only on these populations, those populations being people who are older than the age of 65 years of age. Unfortunately, that has meant that we've sort of just accepted, and I'll talk about this later when I talk about herd immunity, we've sort of just accepted that folks in this portion, which is most of the population, will simply recover from the pandemic, whereas data consistently shows that people, even in these age groups, are having significant sequelae from the pandemic once they do recover from it, if they do recover from it. Speaking of how we are coding data, continuing our first policy failure, is this fairly illustrative set of 3 graphs from 3 states, Indiana being the first one, which tells us how and this started to happen around, I want to say early August, states start to represent their data in sort of inaccurate or misrepresented ways. Let me expand on that a little bit. So this data from the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center gives us 3 pieces of information: how many new cases there are, how much we're testing as an average over 14 days, and then the one I want to focus your attention on, which is the test positivity rate. Described very simply, it's basically the number of people that tested positive divided by the number of people that were tested total during that day, which gives you the daily test positivity rate. The World Health Organization recommends that rate remain lower than 5% before the community or the state or the county reopens. Indiana has an average of 9.6 right now, and based on other data, it's as high as 12%. But what I want to highlight to you is that something interesting is happening with Indiana's data. For example, this little peak right here represents a test positivity rate about a week ago that was 250+%, which means there were more positive tests this day than there were tests conducted, which essentially means that this was one day where the data was all dumped, which is a huge problem if we want to understand the spread of the virus in a granular sense. Compare this to Ohio, where there's a lot, where, by the way, the test positivity rate is below 5%, but they're reporting their data in a more robust way. Similarly, in New York, in the state of New York, they are reporting their data in a more robust way. This is illustrative to show you that at least the states that are doing better, at least there's a correlation to be drawn here. We definitely cannot draw causation, but correlation to be drawn here that they're doing 2 things differently than states that are not doing so well. Number one, they're testing more. And number two, they're doing a better job of explaining what is going on, what are the trends in the state than states that are not being as transparent or as robust in their data representation. Again, you cannot draw any causation here, but there is certainly some, at least an interesting correlation right there. Speaking of correlation, we can kind of look at what Indiana has done in terms of its policies of lockdowns or opening back up and how that has impacted the number of cases. So over here on the y-axis, you have the total number of new cases in any given day. This is actually a rolling average of 7 days to kind of smoothen the data and have a better representation, or else all the data would look like that. And what you see generally are the red represents lockdown and or cessation of reopening. The greens represent policies that were reopening at the state level. The purple or the blue, I'm somewhat colorblind, I can't really tell, represent decisions made at the county level. What do you notice? So let's go at the start of the pandemic around late March, early April is where we saw our first cases in Indiana. And the lockdown began, there was an inertia effect that kept, even though the lockdown was on, that kept the cases increasing. And of course, the cases started to drop. And as soon as that started to happen, we already start to reopen because we started talking about, well, is the virus worse than is the lockdown worse than the virus, which is an absurd question to ask, but it was posed many, many, many times throughout this pandemic and continues to be posed. So what was the effect of a reopening? We started to essentially see cases that were because of the lockdowns which were coming down, start to go back up. So this represents the early stages of reopening. This, I believe, if I remember correctly, represents stage 2 or stage 3 of reopening. And then cases, as you might expect, started to go right back up after we reopened. Then we got to this point where cases started to reopen. So Governor Holcomb called for stage 4.5 to occur, which, again, not really clear what that was. It was essentially a suggestion of not going to stage 5. Cases, what happened when there was a little bit more of a lockdown? Cases did actually go down or at least flatten off. And what do you know? Stage 5, and now we are in the stage 5, meaning, of course, pretty much we are almost back to normal, and cases are going right back up and will continue to do so. My third policy failure represents the failure of the government to communicate the severity of COVID-19. One of the most common things we've heard is this idea that the number of people who are dying in the hospitals are actually not dying of COVID, but are dying of some other disease. There are many ways to dispel this myth, but one of the strongest ones is to look at excess mortality, I should say. So we're going to talk about excess mortality in the state of Indiana specifically. So what is this graph? This graph basically shows you a couple of different things. This yellow line represents, I should back up a little bit. First of all, this graph is not a perfect pictorial representation. There's some modeling in here that is added to the actual number of deaths. So that is a caveat that I must state. However, this yellow line represents the expected mortality for that particular week. So as you can see, it increases. When does it increase? Around a time of the flu, and drops back down in the summer months and comes back up. What do you notice? So going back to January 2017 and then April 2017, there's a couple of weeks where the mortality was about where we expect it to be, slightly north of it. So essentially, everywhere you see a plus, it represents weeks where the mortality was higher than expected. So again, in January 2018, possibly due to the flu, mortality was slightly higher than expected. Stays normal, stays normal, stays normal, and then we get to the pandemic. In Indiana, except for 1 week, every single week has shown trends of excess mortality. And unless someone can convince you that something else is going on that's leading to people dying disproportionately, the most parsimonious explanation is COVID-19. And our current estimate is that at least 2/3 of this excess mortality in the entire country and by extension in Indiana, is due to COVID-19. Here's another failure of the government to communicate the severity of COVID-19. The government policies have focused only on mortality, whereas more and more data has shown us that people that recover from COVID-19, younger people, are having experiencing long-term effects of this disease. When the pandemic started, epidemiologists and virologists said, we just don't know what's going to happen in the long term. We need to be err on the side of caution. That did not occur. We now have cases where people who are recovering from the disease are showing long-term heart damage. Caveat here, because we have to be responsible in how we talk about this. We don't know if this lasts forever because we just don't know. But based on the data we have, people who are recovering are showing longer-term heart damage, even post-recovery. They're showing longer-term brain effects, neurological deficits, neurological effects post-recovery. And if there's one thing you should do after my talk, you should read this incredible story by Ed Yong, where he talks about the long haulers who are redefining COVID-19, people who are recovering from this and having month-long effects where they are just not being able to get back to normal, fatigue, and some of the other symptoms we're talking about. So the final policy I want to talk to you about is that regardless of what is being said, America as a whole has accepted herd immunity as its unofficial soft policy, where people have just accepted that that's what we're doing. We're just going to deal with this. We're just going to live with this. So the first question I want to address for you is herd immunity a realistic way to deal with the pandemic? And pretty much every responsible scientist, every responsible epidemiologist has said no. Without a vaccine, herd immunity is not only not possible, it is highly ethically, scientifically problematic, and it will cause the death of millions of people. However, that has not stopped colleges from reopening. That has not stopped sports teams and leagues from restarting and seeing spikes. That has not stopped people from indulging in personal policies that have led to super spreader events, such as weddings and indoor events, such as these conferences in Indiana, church services held indoors that didn't maintain social distancing and masks have been linked to lockdowns. And ultimately, it comes from the top, all the way from the top. And what's happening at the top? That's what's happening at the top. So people are essentially have accepted that herd immunity is our unofficial policy. However, I want to step away from this. I want to leave you with a historical anecdote as the last thing I'll tell you about. So in around 165 AD, I believe it was, we had the plague of Antonine. And this is the incredible philosopher King Marcus Aurelius during his early reign, or the plague of Antonine, which we, by the way, now believe was smallpox, maybe measles, but very, very likely smallpox, that went through Rome and many other countries. There were actually a lot of some similarities in how it spread and where it started and how it spread between the plague of Antonine as well and the SARS-CoV-2. And one of the things that Marcus Aurelius said at the time in his book Meditations is, for the destruction of understanding is a pestilence, much more indeed than any such corruption and change of this atmosphere which surrounds us. Marcus Aurelius was fighting misinformation and fighting the effects of people not taking the disease seriously and spreading false myths. One of those was this fine gentleman, Alexander of Bonotaicus, I believe is how you say it. I'm just going to call him Alexander because I can never say that second word. Now, this gentleman, who was fascinating, was essentially a cult leader. Historians who have described him as someone who was very insecure about how he looked. He was starting to lose his hair, so he started wearing a wig. He was described as an ardent narcissist, and he spread lots of misinformation, including that dealing with the plague of Antonine was to be a part of his cult. And his cult was surrounding this little snake-like creature here that he believed, he said had divine powers. Now, some of you may draw parables between someone who wears a wig and is a narcissist and spreads misinformation during a pandemic with someone else in our leadership. I will leave that aside, and I will tell you what Marcus Aurelius did. Marcus Aurelius, he developed some policies that did the following things. He put doctors in charge of the health response. He knew that an economic crisis was coming, and he didn't try to explain it as one or the other. He took proactive tests and proactive measures and forgave long-standing debt to the government from his citizenry. He sold the imperial treasures to raise revenue. He taxed the upper class because he knew they could afford it, especially during a time of pandemic where people lost their livelihood. And as a personal thing, he comforted those who suffered losses. He went to funerals. And that is what the philosopher king, Marcus Aurelius, did during the pandemic of his time. And I'll leave you with a final Marcus Aurelius quote. Marcus Aurelius said, "Bear in mind constantly that all of this has happened before, and all will happen again. The same plot from beginning to end." I'll leave you with that quote to, first of all, remind you that we will get through this. We will get through this pandemic. We've seen worse before, the H1N1 pandemic. We will get through it. But it will happen again because of the human impact on deforestation, on climate change, has led to more zoonotic events. And it means that this is not the last pandemic or likely epidemic that we will deal with in our lifetimes. So with that bit of hope and that bit of trepidation, I say goodbye to you. Thank you very much for listening. That's, by the way, that's my booking agent, Octavia, in case you want to chat with me again.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra, and thank you to your wonderful background buddy. He's so cute.
Thank you so much, Allison.
And I mean, talk about increase in zoonotic diseases. I was living in Miami, Florida, working on an immunology lab when the Zika outbreak happened in South Florida. So I totally, I've seen firsthand how devastating these can be, even on a small community, on a small scale. And you mentioned the long haulers. Absolutely. This is a developing story, but you brought up some great points. So thank you, Dr. Chopra. And thank you to everyone who's listening from your couch, your office, your phone, joining us on Twitter, Twitch, YouTube, and or Facebook. If you have any questions for Nipun, or you've already thought of things you'd like to ask one of the panelists, go ahead and just type it in chat. And we'll get to it at the end. And if you'd like to see more content like this, please be sure to like and subscribe at Indiana Sciences and at CinsoIndy for all of our future virtual programming. But before you do that, we have our next speaker, Dr. Diane Henschel. She's an associate professor at the IU School of Policy and Environmental Affairs, also known as SPIA if you're local. She is an expert in risk assessment and sublethal human effects of environmental pollutants. Her research focuses on the effect of a novel, non-invasive treatment to counteract chemical stress. Dr. Henschel's wildlife work also involves correlations between field and laboratory studies, typically focusing on the developmental and neuroendocrine related effects. She served on a number of boards, panels, and advisory committees for agencies including the US-Canada International Joint Commission, the EPA, and the National Research Council. And here she is to give a talk entitled "The National Science Policy Advocacy, Tracking Legislators' Science Voting Records and How It Impacts You." Dr. Henschel, take it away. It seems like we've lost Dr. Henschel. Oh no. She went to go grab a beer, it's Oktoberfest, that time of year. While us goyles and gals are just, oh, Dr. Henschel, are you here? maybe?
Yeah. Am I stable or am I not stable?
You are coming in stable now.
Okay, let's hope it stays that way. Sorry about the issues. Okay, so I'm not talking, it doesn't look like it. Let me go put on my hotspot, see if that helps.
Dr. Henschel, while you're figuring that out, we can go ahead and have Dr. Frank go ahead and talk. If you would like some time to. Okay, I think we are going to let Dr. Henschel troubleshoot. All right, well, so while Dr. Henschel is troubleshooting some of her technical difficulties, apologies, we can go ahead and have Dr. Indra Frank, if you don't mind, you know, kind of flip-flopping the order a little bit. All right, Dr. Indra Frank, she is on the Hoosier Environmental Council's Director of Environmental Health and Water Policy. Her first career was as a physician specializing in pathology. And in 2004, she switched her career to focus on environmental health. And since then has worked in environmental health programs, education, and policy, including 7 years teaching environmental health and toxicology with the Indiana University Fairbanks School of Public Health. And today we'll be talking about environmental health and water policy, how local science policy impacts you. I'm excited to hear about this. Dr. Frank, take it away.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Allison, for the introduction, and thank you to Indiana Sciences for hosting the event this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share slides. And go from there. There it goes. So I work for the Hoosier Environmental Council. Every year we keep an eye on the bills at the Indiana State House that have an effect on our environment. So for tonight, I'm going to talk about science and water policy using examples from the Indiana State House. The Hoosier Environmental Council has been around since 1983, working for a cleaner, healthier environment and a sustainable economy here in Indiana. We are a not-for-profit organization. So I have the privilege of working with this awesome team of folks. That photo taken not long before we all had to go our separate ways and not see each other in person again. So let me start out by talking about a couple of notable bills that passed the Indiana Legislature in 2020. The first one I want to talk about was Senate Bill 229 about wetlands. The photo here is of Eagle Marsh up near Fort Wayne. It turns out that originally 25% of Indiana was wetland. It was a very wet state. During European settlement, the wetlands were drained to make way for farms and for towns. By 1985, it was estimated that more than 85% of the original wetlands had been lost. So the question for a policymaker who's considering policy about wetlands would be, what does it matter that Indiana has lost wetlands? And this is where science can help out and bring information to bear on those policy questions. There are scientists who study wetlands, like those photographed here. One science that informs us about wetlands is the science of hydrology, and it shows that wetlands help prevent flooding. The upper diagram, or landscape, illustrates how when there are intact wetlands in the landscape, they can absorb excess water, whereas the lower image shows that if wetlands have been drained or destroyed, the water has no place else to go, and you wind up with an increased risk of flooding along the waterways. In fact, EPA scientists estimate that a wetland can hold as much of 1 million gallons of water, so that decreases the risk of flooding downstream. The science of chemistry shows us that wetlands help purify water. In fact, this illustration is an example showing that if there are excess phosphates or nitrates in the water, they can be diminished in a wetland because the water flows slowly, so particles settle out, there's decomposition going on, there are microbes and algae that are breaking down those pollutants and helping to release nitrogen back into the atmosphere. So chemistry can help inform us about the importance of wetlands. And from biologists, we have data on the species that depend on wetlands during some portion of their lifespan. So biology shows us that wetlands support biodiversity. So altogether, wetlands help reduce flooding, they purify water, and they support biodiversity. That information from the sciences has made its way to policymakers. Back in the early 1970s, when the US Congress passed the Clean Water Act, they included protection for wetlands because that information about the value of wetlands, was making it into the policy debates. Here in Indiana in 2003, our legislature passed the Indiana Isolated Wetlands Law. This helps protect the wetlands that aren't protected under the Clean Water Act. Again, because our policymakers became aware of the value of wetlands. So let's go back to that bill that was proposed in 2020, Senate Bill 229 about wetlands. This bill would create a new exemption in Indiana's isolated wetlands law for drain reconstruction. So we had the Indiana Isolated Wetlands Law, protection for our wetlands. It had a list of just a few things that were exempt from the law. This bill proposed to add a new exemption, and the image on this slide actually shows a portion of the bill. It was a very short bill, and the text in bold at number 4 there is the actual text that this bill was proposing to add to our wetlands law. So within the list of 3 other exemptions, it was going to add exemption number 4, the reconstruction or maintenance of a regulated drain. Well, it turns out that regulated drains, when they undergo reconstruction, that process could lead to damage to wetlands. The Hoosier Environmental Council got engaged in the discussion on this bill. We brought in other people who are concerned about wetlands, including a scientist from the Audubon Society, to tell policymakers about the importance of wetlands to birds. And we also had a member of the Indiana Wildlife Federation talk about wetlands as habitat. So we did what we could to bring information from scientists into the policy discussion. And it was beneficial. The bill eventually passed, but by the time it passed, it had been amended to reduce the damage that it would inflict on Indiana's remaining wetlands. So with that, I'll go to another policy, the debate that came up during our last meeting of the legislature. And this one had to do with PFAS. So PFAS. And on this slide, we see a schematic with a source of PFAS contamination, an airport on one side, and arrows showing that the PFAS can work their way down into the aquifer underground. And then nearby, we have a home with its own private well, and wells, of course, tap the underlying aquifer in order to get drinking water. PFAS is an abbreviation that stands for perfluoro and polyfluoroalkyl substances. It's a family of chemicals, and this family of chemicals has been used widely in all kinds of applications, including waterproofing, nonstick coatings, paints, also in firefighting foams. And firefighting foams are the reason that this illustration shows an airport. At airports, we have emergency response teams, and those response teams have to fight fires. And it turns out when they go through training for those emergency response teams. They would, train to put out fires, including using their PFAS containing firefighting foams. When the training is over, you rinse off the tarmac. The chemicals from the firefighting foam then sink downward through the ground and eventually get carried to the aquifer. So the question in this case for policymakers is, does it matter that PFAS chemicals get into groundwater? Well, one science that can help inform us about whether it matters is toxicology. And in this case, it turns out there are toxicologists who've been studying the human health effects of various among the family of chemicals called PFAS. The Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry, which is a US federal agency, has looked at those toxicological studies and put together a synopsis that includes the following list of health effects that are associated with exposure to PFAS chemicals: pregnancy-induced hypertension, liver damage, increased cholesterol, thyroid disease, decreased response to vaccines, increased asthma, risk of infertility, and small decreases in birth weight. Information like that has gotten into the policy discussion, and during the 2020 session, information about PFAS chemicals amongst our policymakers brought them to pass Indiana House Bill 1189. It prohibits the use of PFAS-containing firefighting foams during training. It did not eliminate their use during actual firefighting because there were members of the Indiana Association of Firefighters, I believe, that testified that there are some fires for which they feel they still really need the PFAS chemicals. This is just one step to help control the release of PFAS chemicals into the environment. But the science tells us that there's probably more policy work to be done. In fact, at the federal level, the EPA is considering limiting PFAS chemicals in drinking water. That's an important policy discussion, and it's a policy discussion that has to be informed by data that's been collected on the toxicology of these chemicals. So what's coming up for the Indiana Legislature in 2021? We know that there is probably going to be a bill to create carbon offsets through various practices. This bill comes about because there are Indiana-based businesses that are actually working to reduce their carbon footprint, and they would like to buy in-state carbon offsets. So we have legislators that are working to put together a bill that would create a carbon market here in Indiana so that practices like forest conservation, reforestation, or carbon farming could be supported by these businesses buying carbon offsets. Of course, this is also policy that will need to be informed by the science. We need scientists who can tell us how much carbon gets stored through forest conservation, through reforestation, or through carbon farming. If you're interested in information on Indiana environmental issues, the Hoosier Environmental Council sends out an email newsletter on a regular basis. We also maintain a website called Bill Watch each year that looks at the environmentally related bills in the legislature. So that would be at our website with Bill Watch 2021 for next year. And finally, we hold an environmental policy conference once a year. It's coming up soon. Our policy conference is called Greening the State House. It'll be November 20th and 21st this year. And of course, this year it's a virtual conference. But that means there are no limits on the number of attendees. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested in environmental policy discussion in Indiana, to sign up and attend. And with that, I will stop my screen share and pass things back to Allison. Hi, Allison, are you there?
I was enjoying my favorite flavor of water, which is alcohol. Just kidding. It's PFAS free water, although I live next to the airport. So now I'm kind of concerned. I will be keeping track of that Bill Watch website. Thank you for that, Dr. Frank. That was very informative. I feel like all Hoosiers in my block need to be listening to this. All right, Dr. Henschel, I see you're here. Yay. So I already introduced Dr. Henschel. She is a risk assessment expert and is an expert in sublethal health effects of environmental pollutants, and will be telling you how and why it's important to track your legislator's science voting record and to see how it impacts you, which after Dr. Frank's talk, I feel like it's a lot. So Dr. Henschel, I'm interested to know more.
So hopefully my internet will stay stable this time, now that we're off of the everybody logging in period. So despite the fact that my heart is in the same issues that Indra's been talking about, this work that I'm talking about more relates to the issue of why it's important for us to vote. And in this case, I'm talking about why it's important for us to vote. And remember that what happens at Senate and House levels don't just affect other issues. It also directly affects whether or not we get funded for science education, for science research. And in fact, science research and science education includes the health research, education, and policy too. So why am I not being able to do this? There we go. So why do you care? I mean, in the end, it's our legislators, according to the Constitution, who control our budgets, and our budgets include the control for educational programs, including basic science education, as well as the budgets for basic and applied research. Both the funding that ends up supporting our national science institutes, as well as the funding that ends up going out and funding people like me, researchers in academia, researchers in nonprofits. The other issue is that they pass laws from which the environmental and other regulations, health regulations, for example, are derived or are based. And without these laws, we would not have any responses to the environmental problems. We would still have, for example, the Monongahela in Pittsburgh going on fire. So we would still have, or Cleveland on fire, we would still have problems with major air where we couldn't see. Now it only happens when we have the major wildfires, and out west where people were saying that they couldn't even see to the end of their yards or to partway down the block. That used to be the case in Chicago and in LA and in other cities where the air was so bad before the environmental regulations went in to start cleaning up our air, that was actually a not uncommon situation. And there were emergency room effects that correlated directly with those kind of major smog events. And now moving into the future, the funding is going to, and the regulations are going to directly affect our ability to prepare for climate change. So we should be caring about our legislative voting records, and we should be caring about what the voting records are for the people that we talk to. And interesting that I have to do something different here. All right, so just to give you the take-home message right now, what I'm going to be talking about is some research that was done looking at legislative voting records over 2 administrations. So in this case, it was for the last 2 years of Obama against the first 2 years of the Trump administration. And you'd think, oh, there was a major difference between them, and in fact, there wasn't. And in the end, we have to realize that science is the basis for our future economic and environmental and health security. and needs to be supported by legislation. So please pay attention to how your legislators vote before you decide to revote for them again. So this particular analysis is probably the third analysis that I could find. There was one that was about 20 years ago, and there was one about 20 years before that, and I'll show you the one 20 years before that in the 70s. Looking at partisan differences related to voting for and against science. This took place over 2 separate years, or 2 separate semesters at any rate, because it was a student project, and looked at votes in the Senate and votes in the House, and correlated and looked at the differences in their party affiliations with their votes. At the Senate, we could look at both sponsorships and the voting. In the Senate, we could also look at whether or not people voted for questionable or not questionable nominations to the major science research offices, like who ran NOAA, for example, or who runs the Department of Interior. In the House does not vote on nominations, so the House only looked at sponsorships and voting. In both cases, they chose not to look at the major budget bills, because the budget bills, with the exception of very specific amendments to some of the budget bills, it's too complex to pull apart, and there's too much negotiating back and forth, and an awful lot of the budget bills, especially over the last at least 8 years, have involved negotiations kind of behind the scenes that are not obvious. And so what the trade-offs are do not become clearly obvious and can't be analyzed for effect. Just to give you an example of the way that legislation was evaluated, there's a bill that Senate Bill 1512 was a bill to primarily prohibit inclusion of the social cost of carbon and other chemicals as a factor for cost-benefit analysis that's used during rulemaking. It would affect a number of the different agencies, including how the Council on Environmental Quality could analyze the data that they would report on. So since the Council on Environmental Quality does some predictive analysis for the executive branch, in addition to the data that comes from the analysis in, for example, energy or EPA. In the end, the group decided that this was an anti-science bill because it inhibited an inclusion of some aspects of science, including the social science, into the impacts of the evaluation of rulemaking. So how did they do that? They had a group of people that would research every single bill, make decisions based on the potential impacts on science, and it was on science research, on science funding, and on science policy in terms of promotion of use of science in policy. The group would then vote on whether they considered it anti-science or pro-science. At that point, if there was a tie vote or there was a significant disagreement, it would go to a second arbitration level. And then if the arbitrator still could not decide, that bill would not be included. So truly controversial bills that had strong both pro and anti-science aspects to it, which happens a lot in bills when legislators are trying to get something through, they will allow for kind of balancing in an amendment. When that happened, those had to be excluded from the analysis. So just to give you an example of 2 of the types of results that were concluded, the bill that directed NASA to encourage women and girls to study science and technology and engineering and mathematics, a STEM education bill, was considered to be support for science and explicitly support for science education. Whereas the bill that was proposed to amend the Solid Waste Disposal Act to establish a permit allowing for coal combustion residues that could be differentially controlled at the different states was in disagreement. Two major reviewers did not agree in the beginning. It went to the dispute board. The dispute board in this case said it was a negative support for science because the different states would handle this differently, and because the bill especially did not require the plan to be based on science research. So therefore it would allow states to pretty arbitrarily develop their permit program and wouldn't require scientific support for their decisions. All right, just to give you a sense of how the voting resulted, this is the example of how this is, remember, across the two different terms. So this is the last 2 years of Obama and the first 2 years of Trump pooled. There is an analysis that separates them out, and there really wasn't a significant difference. So here, you're looking at the voting on the amendments in the House for specific bills that pass the pro or against. And as you can see, there's a clear difference between how most of the Democrats voted versus how most of the Republicans voted. And you can probably guess some of the people here, and you can probably guess some of the people in the that were voting with the Democrats. In the Senate, the distribution is not quite as extreme, but it still is pretty clearly separated out by party. When you talked about sponsoring bills, so who actually sponsored bills, and this was another value for what was given. So if they sponsored bills that supported science, it would add to their score. If they didn't support bills, or if you didn't support bills, it didn't withdraw from you. So this was just kind of a plus on top of it. And since not everybody supports bills and sponsors bills, this does not include 100% of either the House or the Senate. So of the people in the House that supported bills that were pro science, or, well, in this case, it was harder to be against science. It was either pro science or not. There's a whole lot more overlap in terms of the sponsorship. So there seems to be a lot more bipartisan effort in terms of actually sponsoring bills. The Senate also, there's a little bit more separation, but again, the sponsorship in the Senate, again, seems to be relatively more bipartisan. And notice that, again, there's not everybody in here, so the total numbers is not going to equal 100 in terms of if you looked at the total number of senators in either party who sponsored bills. So the other thing you might want to look for, if you are looking for how your senator or legislator is supporting science, you might also want to be looking at how proactive they are in actually sponsoring bills that are supportive of science, because not all of either the House or the Senate does sponsor science-related bills. In the House, when you're talking about the overall score, this is pooling 3 different metrics. There's a clear separation, and the majority of the Democrats tends to more strongly support science than the Republicans. And this is supporting science across the board, including energy bills, including research on energy bills, not just, for example, renewables, but anything, including nuclear, including oil, including fracking for that matter, have been included as a positive in here. Because anything that supports the research or the education behind the science would have been counted as a positive here. The Senate overall scores were clearly very disparate in the net scoring of it. And you ask, has it always been this way? So this is from the earliest analysis that we could find. This is in the 70s. This is a paper from 1974. So it's the first 4 years of the 70s that are being analyzed. And there's still, but this is only environmental voting, and in only environmental voting, Democrats clearly were more pro-environment or more voting for pro-environment. This is during the period of establishing of the Environmental Protection Agency and expanding of the Department of Interior to start consider more concerns than just kind of use of our resources. Similarly in the House, more of a bias towards, but it's not as extreme. There's more overlap in both cases in the 70s. In the 90s, another science-related analysis also similarly indicated that there was a fair amount of overlap. So what's the conclusion here is that science, and this includes funding for our health and basic sciences, including funding for energy research, any kind of energy research, including funding for environment, including for preparation for climate change, clearly affects our future. And in fact, as I pointed out in the beginning, this is what where our future effort, where our future economies come from. This is where the novel technologies come from. And it's critical to support basic science. So if you are considering that you need to be supporting science, you can go check your voting records of your legislatures and count that into your decisions as you decide about your voting. So in case you want to know how to do it, there are now 3 major, very much expanding in all cases, tools for tracking. Congress.gov, which is the official one from Congress, only goes back to 1989. And so it doesn't really give you a very long comparison. Government Track goes all the way back to 1799, although it's got about 3 or 4 different sources of information, depending on the year, because there was different, I guess, ways that it was tracked over time. All of these, Congress, GovTrack, and VoteView, all include roll call votes. The GovTrack has revised its website relatively recently, and it's kind of cool because it's now got search functions for who your legislators are by address. So you can literally put in your home address and it will tell you who your legislators are. You can also check by legislator, and you can check by your own interest. So you could put in science, you could put in environment, you could put in health, and you will find who's voting which way. And it actually pulls out the different votes for you. VoteView, before GovTrack kind of updated itself, VoteView started tracking for you. What's interesting is that VoteView includes a bill text search and includes its own polarization analysis, which is kind of fun to look at. So I am here to try to encourage you to vote and vote with knowledge. Please go look at your legislature's voting record and vote to support science. And thank you. Allison, it's back to you again.
Thank you, Dr. Henschel. That was a great talk. And I will be sure to check out, I didn't realize GovTrack, the congressional tracker, had been updated. It looks really nice and user-friendly. And I mean, actions speak louder than words, right? And so what's the one action word? Vote. Go vote. We want to encourage you to go vote, and we want to give you some of the knowledge and power to vote in a science-forward manner. So thank you for giving us some of those great tools. So our next speaker will be Dr. Rachel Owen, who's the Executive Director and co-founder of the Missouri Science and Technology Policy Initiative. She works to identify key decision points in the state legislative process and provides timely and relevant scientific information to policymakers through various programs. Her graduate work was in wetland ecology at the University of Missouri, where she received her PhD. And today she'll be talking about building state science policy networks in the Midwest, bringing the best science to legislators. All right, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Owen.
Great, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be part of this panel and excited to be talking with you in Indiana. I'm from Iowa, and so, you know, the I states, everybody thinks we're Indiana when you go to the coast anyways. So I'm excited to be here and speak to you about my experiences on the other half of the Midwest. So like Allison said, I'm going to be talking about building state science networks in the Midwest through my experience as the director and co-founder of MOST Policy Initiative, or Missouri Science and Technology Policy Initiative, but I'm going to heretofore call it MOST. So before I get started, I want to talk about why science is important to me. So when I graduated high school, I started a degree in biology at Iowa State University because all of my science teachers told me I should be a scientist. And I really didn't know what I wanted to do with that. I didn't really have a why as to why I wanted to be a scientist. I was just doing this because my teachers all said I should. In my first semester of college, I was able to take a soil science class and then go on a study abroad trip focused on soil science to Ghana in Western Africa. And I was incredibly struck by the differences in soil. First of all, I was just learning about this, but you could definitely tell that the soil in Ghana was very different than the soil in Iowa. And we really talked a lot about how those soil resources were linked to socioeconomic outcomes in those communities. And I had never thought about soil before. Literally, it had never crossed my mind. And I thought, wow, if soil is this important, this is something that I need to study. And there needs to be more people studying this. So I got into soil science because I was able to see those differences that soil resources could make, and wanted to continue on with getting to know more about the soil so that we could improve people's livelihoods. So around about the time that I realized that I didn't actually want to be a soil science researcher, I was about halfway through my PhD and had made a decision that I thought that policy was probably more the route that I wanted to take. I really loved soil science, but I also really loved talking to people and not so much doing lab work and field work. And so I had an opportunity to go to DC and spend some time on the Hill talking with my legislators. And soon after, I was approached by a couple other graduate students to explore founding a science and technology policy fellowship program in the state of Missouri. So back in 2017, with my co-founders, Mike and Hallie, who are in that picture there on the left, we started meeting with people in Missouri to ask them what this might look like. We wanted to see, you know, is there a place for PhD level scientists at our state capital? What would they do? What could they help with? What are the existing resources that they have in Jefferson City that we could help to fill? And we just started having those conversations. So we met with policymakers. Here pictured is the Commissioner of Higher Education, who's been on our advisory board since the very beginning. We talked with legislators, scientists. We talked to a lot of lobbyists and other organizations, people who provide science to policymakers, to try to get a feel for what this might look like. So then fast forward 2 years, both of my co-chairs went off to other jobs, and I was able to take over as the director full-time of MOST Policy Initiative. And then this year we were able to hire our first class of fellows. So I'm really excited. We have 5 postdoctoral fellows. They work on a variety of topics at the Capitol in Jefferson City, and I'll talk more about what exactly it is that they do later on. And we also have another full-time staff person who runs our state science network. So it's been amazing to see our program grow from just being 3 graduate students who were trying to do this with their spare time to being an organization that now has 7 full-time employees, and we're growing. We're adding more fellows here next year as well. And I did want to mention, for comparison, if I can get my slide to advance, there we go. So Missouri has a fairly similar government structure to Indiana politically. So we have a Republican governor, and then we have a supermajority Republican House and Senate, with about the same amount of members that you have in Indiana. And so when I'm talking about the lessons that we've learned over the past few years in this position, a lot of my experience comes from working with conservative lawmakers. And I think that's probably something similar that you would be facing in Indiana. And when we first started working on this program, we were told by a lot of states that we wouldn't be able to start a science policy program in Missouri because we were such a red state. But I think that we've done a really great job adapting and figuring out how to have these conversations with a broad range of people with different backgrounds. So today I'm going to share with you 4 lessons learned from building our program and what's been effective so far based on our conversations with policymakers and other stakeholders in Missouri. So my first lesson that we've learned is to start early in the process. So back in 2018, we had a summit where we brought together lawmakers, scientists, and those science providers that I mentioned earlier, like lobbyists, nonprofits, other people who are active at the Capitol but don't necessarily do scientific research. They're bringing science to the policymakers. We had about 30 people. We kept them for a full day to ask them all sorts of questions about how science and policy interact and how we can fit into that process. All of the participants there were asked to answer this question. And so they were given this question of scientists should report scientific results and the options they had were to leave others to make policy decisions, interpret the results for others who are involved in the policymaking process, work closely with policymakers to integrate scientific results into policy decisions, or to actively advocate for specific policy decisions. And overwhelmingly, everybody in the room emphasized that it's really important for scientists to both report their scientific results and work alongside of policymakers through the policymaking process. So starting early was really what they emphasized, building relationships so that when they go to vote on an issue, they're not getting bombarded with all these different facts and information, because at that point, they don't necessarily have the capacity to really process that information. So they encouraged us to start early, get to know people, so that way we could be of assistance early on. And they offered that same advice to any scientist. So this wasn't just to the scientists in our program. This was something that they wished would happen with university scientists across the state. So our fellows program, so we have a part-time legislature. They meet from January to May each year. And I'm often asked how we have a full-time fellowship program with legislative fellows if our legislature only meets for 5 months. But policy isn't just made in those 5 months. Yes, that's when it's voted on and passed, but bill drafting starts right now. It starts in the fall. And so right now our fellows are building relationships with lawmakers, and they've already been asked, they started in September and they've already been asked, I think, to comment on 12 different bills that are being written, which I think is amazing and is a really exciting response for our first year. But we're spending a lot of time working at this front end. We're trying to respond to what they were saying, say that we want to offer ourselves as resources early on in this policymaking process and not just wait until they're going to vote on the floor. Now we're going to follow our scientific issues and our bills through until they get to the floor and are voted upon and answer questions along that path. But we know that we can have the most impact right now as they're starting to figure out how they're going to craft their legislation. Okay, lesson number 2, talk about the process. So I'm currently reading Hope Jaren's new book, A Story of More. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. I was really struck by a quote in the very first chapter of this book where she said, "We shouldn't be surprised when scientists are wrong." Somewhere, however, we began to hope that scientists were different, that they could be right all the time. And because they're not, we kind of stopped listening. And I feel this a lot sometimes. I think that as scientists, we present scientific information like it's always right, and then sometimes forget about talking about why science should be wrong sometimes and why we should have failed experiments and have an iterative process of getting to learn about different scientific concepts. So I spend a lot of time talking to legislators about the scientific process and why sometimes scientists are wrong. So an example of this, so my very first hearing last year while I was in this position full-time, so it was a hearing on biodiesel and if we should pass a biodiesel mandate in our state. So I listened to people come up and testify in favor of the bill, people come and testify opposed to the bill, and it was a little interesting. So the people who brought forth information in support of the bill were citing that they were citing a specific study that said that carbon emissions would decrease with a switch to biodiesel or an addition of biodiesel into our fuel system. Well, the people who were coming to testify against the bill were citing the exact same study, which I was just really excited people were citing studies, but they were citing the same study and they were saying that biodiesel would increase carbon emissions. So if you're a legislator who doesn't necessarily understand the scientific process, you are very confused at that point as to why people are giving you contradictory scientific information. And so part of what I do in my position and what our fellows do is try to help legislators understand why science disagrees with itself sometimes and why sometimes science will change over time. And in this case, they were citing the same study and just citing two different ends of a confidence interval. And so they were both right. And then we tried to talk about why they were both right, but also both a little wrong in how they were presenting it. So we try to be the people in the room who are not agenda driven, really trying to talk through the facts. Okay, lesson number 3. This is my favorite thing to do in a room full of people. And since this isn't a room full of people, it can't be quite as interactive. But normally I ask the room, do you think that when I walk into a room at the Missouri Capitol as a female scientist, do you think people think I'm a liberal or conservative? And usually I have people raise their hands. When I say conservative, nobody raises their hand. And when I say liberal, everybody in the room raises their hand. Well, I think that that's exactly right. When I walk into the room in Jefferson City and say that I'm there to talk about science, people assume that I have a certain political leaning. And it's good for me to know that. So for me, some of the strategies I take to overcome that is that I always lead by saying I'm a soil scientist and that I worked with farmers during my degree. And in Missouri, everybody hunts. So I also usually add that I'm a hunter. I try to throw that into the conversation pretty early. But I try to acknowledge, I try to understand what people are going to perceive as some of my biases, and then be able to try to help overcome them when I'm introducing myself or talking about my work as an individual. And the reason why I bring this up is because we had a lot of conversations with policymakers early on that said, I know the science isn't biased, but you're biased. Like scientists are biased. There's no way a human can't be biased in some way. And I think they're right. I think that there are always going to be some things that we have some bias on, that we're passionate about, that sometimes pervade logic, and acknowledging those biases in ourselves is important. And so I'll use agriculture as an example again. My friends and family are all involved in agriculture, are livestock farmers. And so sometimes it's hard for me to talk about agricultural statistics that may place a bad light on farmers. And I'll be maybe not upfront with the policymaker that I'm talking to that would be the case, but I try to acknowledge that in myself because I think that helps me, check myself and make sure that I'm presenting that science in a responsible manner, even though I personally have an investment into that topic. So finally, lesson number 4 is to showcase your identity. So I am a scientist, a soil scientist, and I am also a daughter and a granddaughter and an aunt to my wonderful niece and nephews. I am a neighbor, a business owner. I am a Christian. I am a baker and a quilter and a runner and a golfer. And these are all things about me that are part of my identity in addition to being a scientist. And I think that being able to talk about some of those other parts of your identity help you to create some empathy with the people that you're talking to in policy. And I will say, I acknowledge that I am a white woman married to a white man. And so I have certain privilege in saying this, but I really like thinking about these other parts of my identity and being able to talk about them with policymakers. I think a really great example of this is Dr. Hayhoe. If you're not familiar with Dr. Hayhoe, she's a climate scientist based at Texas Tech, but she's become a worldwide science on climate change communication speaker. And one of the things that she always brings up is that she is married to an evangelical minister. She's an evangelical Christian, and it's part of her identity when she's talking about climate change. And that opens so many doors for her to talk about climate change with communities that don't think that you can believe in climate change and be a Christian, for instance. And so I pulled this picture, and the article said an evangelist for climate science. So it goes right in her name. That's part of her identity, and she's really embraced that as part of her identity, and it's opened doors for her. And my last example is a little bit more local. I was at a science policy workshop at one of our state's universities, and I had a faculty member come up to me. He was telling me about this creek behind his house that was always polluted, always had trash in it, and he hated letting his kids play in it. But then he said that whenever he talks to his city council about it, that he always just sticks with the science because he's a scientist and he can only talk about the facts. But can you imagine if he also talked about the fact that he was a parent? It doesn't necessarily have to be either or. And so we just talked, and I encouraged him to say, you know, it's also okay to acknowledge that you're a member of the community. In fact, that probably helps you in having a relatable conversation with some of the members of your city council who are making those decisions. So just to recap, some things that you can start doing today to continue building Indiana's state science and technology policy network. Start the conversation, even if you don't know the issues yet. You have to get your foot in the door early. Practice explaining uncertainty and the scientific process. Identify and acknowledge your biases, whether those be biases perceived that you might have or actual biases you might have. And then be an active member of your community, embrace your identity, and don't be afraid to talk about it. And finally, keep talking about why science is important to you. Thank you so much. I am so honored to be here again and look forward to your questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Owen. Thank you for that fire talk, 'cause it's getting chilly here in the Midwest. That was a terrible joke. I really apologize. But it's a great opportunity to plug our seasonal reasons greetings ugly sweater from the indianasciences.org/merch shop, where you can grab a mask, grab a sweater, and get ready for that winter chill. If you're here in the Midwest, if you're not in the Midwest and you're like my family bragging about how nice it is in Florida, well, you can still get one. Just turn the AC down. Thank you, Dr. Owen, once again, and thank you to everybody who's joining us on Twitch, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and all of the above. It's great to have you here. So our next speaker, I almost got concerned that I was back in lecture, back in first year, but thankfully, Dr. Sullivan is here to talk about something very exciting. He's a Showalter Professor of Pharmacology and Toxicology at the IU School of Medicine and the author of Pleased to Meet Me, Genes, Germs, and the Curious Forces That Make Us Who We Are. His research at the IU School of Medicine focuses on genetics and microbiology, but he's also a renowned teacher, researcher, and science communicator featured on multimedia outlets, including CNN, Fox and Friends, and The Doctors. And here is going to talk about the curious forces that influence political alignment, how our world shapes who we are. Dr. Sullivan, thank you for coming.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Can everyone see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I want to just quickly thank the organizers for the invitation. These events are always very wonderful to do. I love meeting all the new panelists as well. And I want to thank the organizers for their tireless dedication in advocating science. Like Allison said, my talk is going to draw a little bit from a book that I published called Pleased to Meet Me, Genes, Germs, and the Curious Forces That Make Us Who We Are. Came out about a year ago in National Geographic Books. And the thesis of this book is basically to teach people the biological basis for their behavior, their personality, their beliefs, and their actions, not only to understand themselves better, but to understand other people better. And it's really important that people in positions where policy can be made get a grip on how the nuts and bolts of behavior actually work. Because if we have a better understanding of ourselves and why we do the things we do, I think that's just going to make for more intelligent policy making and education. So the subject I want to talk about today has come up in the news every so often. This topic of genes and DNA. It's been getting a lot of press over the past couple decades because we are getting very, very close to being able to edit our genomic code, the recipe for life. And there's a lot of companies out there who will sequence your genome and promise this or that, or tell you what you should be eating, what sort of exercises you should be doing, all sorts of things. And almost every month you see studies being reported in the main news about a gene that's been implicated in such and such. And it makes you wonder, are we genetic robots? And if someone had your DNA sequence, could they use it like a crystal ball and actually predict your behavior? So I think most people appreciate that to some small extent, this is true. There are some clear examples where the prediction algorithms are 100%, and especially for like disease genes like sickle cell or Huntington's, if you have that genetic variation, there's a virtual 100% chance that you're going to have that condition. But when you talk about things like beliefs, behavior, someone's proclivity towards violence or peace, or who they vote for, these are much more complicated behaviors that rely on not only networks of genes, but your environment. You cannot take the gene out of the context of the environment. And that's one of the key things that I want to stress in the book. And tonight, I'm going to tell you one of the major mechanisms that allow at a biological level for that flexibility to take place. And that's a force called epigenetics. For those of you who haven't heard this word before, it literally means beyond the gene, and it is referring to changes that take place on DNA or on the proteins that associate with DNA that can affect whether a gene is activated or not. So this is a busy slide that introduces the multiple layers of epigenetic mechanisms that we don't have time or need to go into. I just want to point out one to illustrate how epigenetics is different than a genetic mutation. And let's look at DNA methylation. So all this is a simple chemical modification that is taking place on the DNA molecule. So if someone has a genetic mutation, that's a change in the DNA sequence itself, okay? And that we don't have the technology to change that yet. And it can be passed on to future generations. It's heritable. DNA methylation or other chemical modifications don't change the genetic sequence, but they temporarily can change how that gene is activated. So you might have been taught back in biology that genes can be turned on or off. That's true, but genes can also be turned on to different levels, okay? So they operate more like a dimmer switch than a straightforward on or off position. And when you consider that we have about 25,000 different genes, that's an incredible amount of flexibility buried within your genetic code. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of different versions of you that is contained within your genetic code. The one that is currently living and breathing and thinking the thoughts you're thinking now has been brought out by the environment that you grew up in. So I'm going to go through some really exciting experiments that support that hypothesis. So let me tell you a little more about DNA methylation and how this epigenetic mark has solved an age-old mystery in genetics. It's been known for quite some time that as identical twins age, they start to exhibit differences, some subtle, some significant. And it was always puzzling because these individuals are genetic clones of one another. They are the same gene for gene. But if you look at some of these examples of identical twins, you can see some differences. Right here, we have twins where one appears to be a little older than the other, even though they're the same age, maybe a little angrier. Here we have identical twins who are discordant for obesity. One twin is lean, one twin is obese. You may recognize these guys, the Property Brothers from television. Identical twins, but one is taller than the other. And they also have very different likes, okay? This one likes to do the construction. This one likes the business aspect of what they do. I'm not quite sure what's going on with these identical twins down here, but you can see there's some subtle differences there. So,
Dr. Sullivan, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think you meant to be screen sharing and you indeed are not.
really? Okay, how about now?
You were doing great. I mean, I was all on it, and then you started pointing to twins, and even with the picture, I honestly struggle.
So can you see now?
No.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Let's see if we can fix that real quick.
Yes, we can. Perfect. Yay.
Okay. So I'm gonna back up just a little bit and we'll fly through this. So this is what you should have been seeing. And you saw that, right, at the beginning?
No.
No? Okay.
We're doing great, so we didn't want to interrupt.
All right, sorry about that. Well, this is the book that I was referring to. And this was my slide talking about, is DNA your destiny? How it can't really be used as a crystal ball for complex behaviors. And then I got into the definition of epigenetics. A lot of different mechanisms here. We're focusing on DNA methylation for the purposes of this example, which is a reversible epigenetic mark. And when it occurs, it basically starts to shut the gene off. So it turns it down. The more methylation, the more the gene gets shut off. And here's the twins I was talking about. Now, hopefully you can see the differences I mentioned, okay? These twins are identical, but one looks a little older, maybe angrier. These are this identical twins discordant for obesity, the Property Brothers I mentioned. And then this one is thrown in as a joke. So let's look at some data here. Scientists were able to analyze the chromosomes of very young twins, okay, 3-year-old twins. And what you're looking at here is the chromosome from one of the twins and the analogous chromosome for the other twin, okay? Everywhere you see yellow is an identical methylation mark, okay? This is where the methylation marks are the same. And in very young twins, the methylation marks are very similar. When scientists look at 50-year-old twins, they see that a lot of those methylation marks are different now. You see very few areas of yellow. So while they're the same gene for gene, their genes are not being expressed at the same level, okay? And that's what's thought to bring about some of the differences that we see in both their physical attributes as well as behavioral. So the analogy that I like to draw is that you can think of your genes as the piano keys, but the environment plays the song, okay? You are born with the genes that mom and dad gave you. There's no changing that. They're like the keys on a piano. You can't change those, but you can play a lot of different songs on those same keys, all right? And that's what the environment is doing when it tickles our DNA, you know, instead of tickling the ivories. So there's a lot of different versions of you in your DNA. So I'm going to go through 4 really wild experiments just to illustrate some of these principles. So what you're looking at here, you would think these are 2 completely different strains of mice. They look remarkably different, right? But they're genetically identical. They're clones of one another. But here we have one that's lean and brown and one that's obese and yellow. How can they be so different if they have exactly the same genes? Well, that's where epigenetics and the environment come into play. So the yellow mouse shown here is expressing a gene called agouti, and the normal brown mouse is not expressing that gene. So agouti is expressed in all mice when they're very young. It puts little yellow highlights into the fur. And you can see that in the brown mouse, okay? Agouti has a double function. In addition to highlighting the hair yellow, it also controls appetite, okay? And when the mice are very young, the agouti expression encourages them to eat, okay? Which is what a young mouse should be doing. But after a very short period, the agouti gene is supposed to be shut off by DNA methylation. And that's how you get a healthy, normal mouse. But if this agouti gene is not shut off by DNA methylation, this happens. The fur continues to be yellow all the time because agouti is always on. And in addition to that, it keeps eating and eating and eating because agouti hasn't been shut off. So these scientists recognized that this is what was going on, and they tried an idea that is just remarkable. So they took these, they took pregnant agouti mice, which you can imagine have, obese pups, but they fed those pregnant agouti mice extra folate during the pregnancy. So folate is a nutrient source that generates a lot of methyl groups. So these mice now have the ability to methylate a lot more DNA than they're normally doing. And all of their pups, even though the moms were big yellow fur balls, all the pups were born lean and brown, just because of this simple dietary change. And I think this is just an amazing experiment that if it occurs in humans, this has profound ramifications that tell us, generally speaking, that our diet is much more important than we like to believe, and could be actually modifying the intensity of gene expression that controls appetites and potentially other features as well. Another really exciting experiment was done by Shelley Berger at the University of Pennsylvania. She works with ants and how their DNA might be epigenetically modified to give them different jobs in the colony, okay? So these Florida carpenter ants in the colony, they're all identical twins. They're all clones of one another, yet we have physical and behavioral differences. Some are small foragers, the other ones are large guards. So what her group was able to do, and this is pretty mind-blowing, they're able to inject an epigenetic drug straight into the brain of the young major ants. So that's pretty remarkable in and of itself. But what happened is even more remarkable. When they put this epigenetic drug into the brain of young major ants, they became foragers instead of soldiers. So she literally changed the job that they're supposed to be destined to do just by putting this drug into their brains and altering the expression of their DNA patterns. So they reprogrammed the ant's behavior. Pretty remarkable. Epigenetics might have a greater impact on us at a generational level than we currently appreciate. So let's look at this very bizarre experiment that tells us that our behavior could be haunted by epigenetic ghosts. Okay, get a little Halloween theme in here. So like most people, mice normally love the smell of almonds, but not if a scientist shocks them while they're getting a whiff of the scent. In this case, they develop a very unnatural fear of the smell of almonds, okay? Now, if we mate mice that are now afraid of almonds, we would never predict that their children would be born scared of almonds, basically born with a new instinct. But that's exactly what happens in this experiment. So these children have never been shocked when they smelled almonds. They've never seen their parents get shocked. They were just born with this new fear. It's remarkable. And then even more strange, their kids still have this fear. Okay, so we're talking about a multi-generational effect. It eventually does go away and the mice are born loving the smell of almonds once again. But for at least a couple generations, this learned behavior was inherited. And the mechanism, I don't have time to expand on it here, was epigenetics. So Scientists use this phrase, transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. That's a mouthful. Scientists like to use lots of syllables in their words because they're capable of doing so. But it basically says your cravings, your fears, what makes you happy, these self-defining traits could actually be pre-programmed into your DNA by your parents or even your grandparents' environment. So if this sort of phenomena is true in humans, and that's obviously very hard to test, we can't do this sort of thing in humans, that would be quite remarkable. Now, while we can't do this to our children or somebody else's kids, we can look at historical records. And there is evidence from the Dutch famine of World War II that children and grandchildren of mothers who were starved during that period are born with what scientists call a thrifty genotype. They maximize calorie extraction from their food. And a thrifty genotype is maladaptive in today's world. Obviously, there's no more famine. On the contrary, we live in a high calorie rich world. And this thrifty genotype, which was triggered by epigenetic changes on the DNA, is now maladaptive. And many of these children are suffering from obesity and diabetes. The final example I want to put up is a very pertinent one that refers to adverse childhood experiences. Now, this is things like bullying, neglect, physical abuse, separating kids from their parents, any sort of adverse childhood experience. We all know and appreciate that this causes psychological damage. It leaves psychological scars, but it also leaves epigenetic scars on the DNA, according to scientists who conducted this study in 2009. These adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, induce DNA methylation at a gene that encodes for a glucocorticoid receptor. And like I said before, DNA methylation suppresses genes, it turns them off. And this is a receptor that you definitely do not want turned off because it cleans up a stress hormone called cortisol, which children exposed to ACEs are secreting all the time. So it's really urgent that they have this, it's really important they have this receptor, but their body has shut it off because they're in a hyper stressed mode all the time. And this has significant consequences down the road, even if they are removed from that environment and are in a better environment. The damage was done. And unfortunately, these children, despite moving to a better environment, still exhibit higher rates of violence, depression, and suicide because of this epigenetic change that happened when they were very young. So this is a very urgent cry, evidence-based experiment that tells us something that common sense has told us all along. We really need to treat our children well, and we need to intervene when policies or other places around the world are mistreating children. This is going to create a very vicious cycle. So to kind of sum up and to allude to some of the other things that we learned tonight, there are all sorts of things in our environment that have been linked to either good or bad epigenetic changes. So it is really critical that we assess the environment and how it is modifying our DNA at an epigenetic level in order to move forward with happiness and well-being and creating intelligent policies for everyone. If we understand how the environment interplays with our genetics, we're going to be in a much better position to form policy. So that's just a brief snippet of some of the things that are covered in the book that you see here. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to addressing any questions after we're finished.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan, for that insightful talk. You know, every time I've listened to you talk about different snippets of your book multiple times, and I feel like every time I listen, I learn something new, and it's always so enthralling. So thank you. And thank you for mentioning the adverse childhood effects and how this can have transgenerational effects on, experiencing childhood trauma. That's seeing, our theme today is science and policy. and how policy, science needs to inform policy. And so thinking about traumatic childhood events and separating children from their parents and how that can have such long lasting effects that we still don't understand completely, that seems very relevant, but we won't go into that. So thank you, Dr. Sullivan.
My pleasure.
All right, multi-stream friends, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, all of you, hello, hello, hello. We are introducing our final speaker, and let me just say, I am so excited to hear from Dr. Carlotta Berry. I follow her on Twitter, I have to confess. I've been following her on Twitter, and if you don't follow at Dr. C.A. Berry on Twitter, y'all are missing out, because truly it's an experience. Just before we get started, Dr. Berry, I do want to remind everyone, go ahead and drop your questions in chat on whatever platform you're watching on, streaming on, and we will get to them right after Dr. Berry's talk. And then again, I mean, not just Dr. Berry, Dr. Sullivan also is on the social medias, including the Twitter. I'm Twitter partial, I apologize. That's just how I am. But you can find all of our wonderful speakers on Twitter, on social media, and you can find them at Indiana Sciences, at Indiana Sciences. We've tagged all of them throughout the night. And, but I cannot believe I'm so excited to hear from Dr. Berry. She is an associate professor of electrical and computer engineering at RIT. Her expertise includes educational mobile robotics and enhanced human robotic interfaces. She specializes in the recruitment and retention activities for underrepresented populations in electrical and computer engineering. She's a co-advisor for the Rose Building Undergraduate Diversity Rosebud program, which she helped found. And currently, she co-directs the multidisciplinary robotics program and is an organizer and judge for the first robotics competition, and will be talking to us about who gets to do science and how policy at academic institutions influence science. So Dr. Berry, take it away.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. Let me share my slides. And please confirm that you can see them. I know we had some issues with the last speaker, so I just want to make sure we're good.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So thank you so much, Indiana Scientists, for inviting me to speak this evening. And most importantly, thank my former student, Rufus Cochran, for reaching out to me. This is actually the second time I've been invited to speak. I spoke at the March for Science, I believe in 2015, at the Indiana State House, and it's still one of the highlights of my career. So today I'm going to shift gears a little bit from what some of the other speakers talk about. And although I am a roboticist and I do engineering education research, I'm going to talk to you about some of the powerful things that have been happening on social media and what that has meant for me and the Black and Engineering social justice movement. So although you see me here right now, I am actually representing many, many people, maybe 400 or more, who represent Black in STEM. So first, I will share a little bit about me. So I am about intersectionality and what that means. It has a lot of meanings to say these days, but when I talk about it in terms of engineering education. So Richard Boyer states that the work of the professoriate may be separated into 4 separate but overlapping functions. They are the scholarship of discovery, integration, application, and teaching, and that these must be seen as an inclusive view of scholarship that is a synthesis of research, practice, and teaching. So what that means is that when you look at me, I'm not just an electrical engineer, I'm not just a roboticist, but I am a student of the world, and I am a Black woman, and there are many things that make up who I am. And I have to bring all of those together to who I am in the classroom, who I am on Twitter, who I am as a mother and as a wife. So the way I encapsulate that is, I bring robotics and STEM to people, and I bring people to robotics and STEM with a primary goal of diversifying the profession. And that's what I'll talk about today. And I want to thank Allison for following me on Twitter. So the hashtag I like to use is Nowhere Steminist. I made that up. It's kind of French, but not really. I don't speak French, so I'm sure it's not proper. But my hashtag is DRCABERRY, Dr. C.A. Berry, as Allison said. So I tweet about a lot of different things. So don't come over to my Twitter timeline thinking it's all robots and engineering education, because I'm intersectional, as I talked about. So here's a little bit of my intersectionality before I transition into the Black and Engineering Social Justice Movement. So because I'm intersectional and I like to use robotics to hit on a lot of different things, I highlight that here. So this top center picture is me teaching some of my freshman students robotics in order to do engineering design. So robotics is great for demonstrating multidisciplinary intersections between science, engineering, computer science, mechanical, electrical, etc. Here I am getting an award at a first robotics competition where I actually was the organizer for the Crossroads Regional, and I've also been a judge for several years. Down here is I'm a mentor for First Lego League, which is my daughter's Girl Scouts robotics team. I'm really big about bringing more girls and more underrepresented populations into STEM, because that's really where we have to go. The world is diverse, so if engineers have to design solutions and processes to improve the world, they need to reflect the world we live in. I actually teach my students about that, and I give them examples of designs that have not worked because there was not a diverse person on the team. Here in the middle is me doing more outreach with an all-girls STEM camp, middle schoolers, and here I'm doing research with, of course, some of my female students at Rose-Hulman. So the motivation for my talk started during summer 2020. So as much as 2020 has done to all of us, one of the things that happened is we knew we were in the midst of a pandemic and a lot of people started to work from home. And what that meant was there were more eyes on social media and there were more eyes on television. So some things that happened got a lot more attention. So the first thing that happened was the death of George Floyd. A lot of people were able to see him killed on live television or on social media, and it sparked the Summer of Black Lives Matter protests. And what that meant is that people were also recognizing some things they may have never seen before. Around that same time, about a week later, the hashtag Black in the Ivory started trending on Twitter. And that was all about Black academics sharing some of the experiences they have as professors, including marginalization, isolation, implicit bias, unconscious bias, and all those kind of things. I got really excited because I wanted to go and see what types of things people were sharing to see if any of them reflected on some of my experiences as one of the few Black faculty at my school. And I was so disappointed that I didn't see any engineering or computer science posts. It was mostly humanities and political science and medical doctors and things like that, which is great. But where are the engineers at? So I went and shared in this listserv that I have with about 400 Black engineers. You guys gotta get on this Black in the Ivory thing. There's some powerful stuff happening on social media. We're all home right now. This is the time to make it happen. And what we soon discovered is a lot of academics are a little afraid of social media. They're a little concerned about, you know, I don't want to post something that may look bad or reflect on my university or reflect on my students. But I think there was something really powerful that started to happen. And what happened is Black in X was formed. So on Twitter, you started to see Black in neuroscience, Black in geoscience, Black in genetics, Black in mathematics, Black in AI, Black in robotics, Black in computing. And then they started having these weeks, and all of a sudden, all these connections with all of these people who were on their campuses or in their research labs and felt isolated and alone, they found Twitter and made something powerful happen. So my community formed Black in Engineering. And we formed this group with Black engineers from industry, government, and academia. And what we decided was there's too much happening in the world for us only to focus on our research papers, publications, teaching, service in our little bubble. It's time for engineers to break out of Dilbert, MacGyver, or Sheldon mode and impact the world. Excuse me, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention, I have bronchitis, so I gotta have a sip of water. So what we did was we formed the Black in Engineering Social Justice Movement. So the components of Black in Engineering are our message, of course, which is to amplify Black voices in STEM and engineering in order to diversify the profession, and also to connect with more allies to have policy, education, and awareness, to have a social media campaign, which is our Black in Engineering Week, as well as us tweeting about things relevant to all engineers. We have a call to action, which I'm going to share a little bit of the components of that with you this evening. We do community engagement. We also, I'm part of Black in Robotics, for example. We're doing a Zoom introduction to robotics in a couple of weeks. So now that we're all at home working from home and Zoom is our life, we're doing things we never thought to do before while we're in the house. Not only are we connecting with allies, we're doing strategic planning, finance, and fundraising. So I'm going to share a little bit about some of the things we do. But the first thing I want to do is share this video with you. This video has garnered over 6,000 views on YouTube for a bunch of nerdy engineering professors. We're very proud of that. So I want to share this with you first before I talk a little bit about our call to action.
I'm Black with a PhD, but I still could have died by me. I am George Floyd.
I've succeeded using my head, but I still could have been shot in bed. I am Breonna Taylor.
I think teaching and learning is fun, but I could get killed while out on the run. I am Ahmaud Arbery.
I'm a hidden figure in STEM who puts my hood on, like Trayvon.
And can't be stopped, like Sandra Bland. All racism, I do condemn.
I engineer like Imhotep, but my black skin I can't sidestep.
I can't breathe. I'm Eric Garner. This is not a game. I'm Tamir Rice.
What if I'm next? Then it's hashtag Denise R. Simmons.
If it's hashtag Leroy Long, I am Laquan McDonald. I am Ayanna Stanley Jones. I am Walter Scott.
I am Katherine Johnson, Philando Castile, Alberta Spruill, and Samuel DuBose.
We will not be silenced.
It is our turn to have a say.
So on behalf of the STEM community, this is what Black STEM faculty like us have to say.
It says PhD outside of our office doors, but we still get mistaken for janitors.
And we love our custodians. There's no hierarchy when it comes to Black labor. They allowed us to get where we are.
Say something back, to speak up and speak out. Then we get blacklisted or just get kicked out.
Love to teach, only to get called bad names. Names they wouldn't own if you called them out.
Love to do research,
but it's only safe if we sell out.
Don't research Black or shout.
Keep the faith. Keep the faith.
Black lives matter.
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 Black lives
matter.
I'll rise up. I'll rise like the day. I'll rise up. I'll rise unafraid. I'll rise up. And I'll do it 1,000 times.
So that's just one of the many videos we've shared. We also have some on our research, on our service, on our teaching, where we talk about why we love engineering, why we love doing research and all those kind of things. And really the purpose of our social media and our messaging campaign, we have a YouTube channel, is to, like I said, normalize Black STEM. And also it's not just for Black people, but it's for young people to see that engineering is for anyone who gets excited about making and creating things. It's not about being super smart or a genius or you've got to be the best at calculus. It's about being a hard worker and being dedicated. So one of the things we did is we created a call to action because we didn't want to just stop at sharing our work, but we wanted to talk about how to make an anti-racist institution so that we could share this with deans and department heads and presidents and vice presidents. So I wanted to share our call to action with you, but in the midst of working on that, we discovered that surgeryredesign.com had also made one for the individual. So I wanted to lead into our call to action with this one because we found this one equally as powerful. So there are 3 levels of becoming an anti-racist individual. There's the fear zone, the learning zone, and the growth zone, right? So obviously the fear zone is, I deny racism is a problem. I try to avoid those hard questions. Things are a little bit uncomfortable, and it's okay if that's where you start. But then at some point you move to the learning zone. You want to educate yourself about it, be vulnerable about your gaps. Maybe you read some books about it. And then as your growth zone is now where you are educating your peers about it, you speak out about it, and you become an ally and promote and advocate. So that transitions really nicely into some of the things that we did in our call to action. I will be honest with you, it's a very large document. So this is a summary of it. So I would love for you to go read it on our website, blackandengineering.org. You can also follow us on Twitter at Black and Engineering as well. But the first parts of that call to action are the overarching principles. One of them is attitude, and that's acknowledging that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. The other one is clarity. Be clear about what you're trying to address. It's anti-racist behavior for Black students or whatever group that may be, right? So you have to be very clear that the experiences of Black students, Black faculty, and Black staff is going to be different from Asian students or Hispanic. So you have to disaggregate your data and make sure you're doing things to actually address the needs of those populations. There must be commitment and resources. Nothing can change if there's not a committed population from the Institute, as well as resources in order for things to change. And then institutional accountability. There needs to be some kind of dashboard or some kind of external organization or some place where the things are amplified that you want to do, whether that's changing your percentage of students that you recruit, the number of faculty that you have, whether it's organizing a Center for Diversity or how many diversity events, et cetera. So the first part of the call to action are these 4 overarching principles. I have them on this pie chart all at 25%, but that's by no means saying that they're all going to be equally distributed. It really depends on your institution and what you've already done and where you are in the process. Then there's several recommendations in the call to action as well. I will talk about the system-wide recommendations, but on our website, we also have recommendations specifically for faculty with respect to things like tokenism, for promotion, tenure, et cetera. Same for staff development and professional development. And there's also some recommendations for undergraduate and graduate students. For example, undergraduate students could be a bridge program to bring more diverse students to campus. There should be a bridge program to help them with their transition to calculus and physics. Or for graduate students, making sure you're being fair about the types of things we're asking them to do. One thing we've discovered over this summer is that a lot of postdocs and PhD students are given the diversity work at the institution. That once again steps back from having institutional accountability that you have the graduate students doing the diversity work. So other system-wide recommendations are historical education. What has happened in the past? What does diversity work on your campus look like? What does implicit bias work look like, or marginalization work? Implicit bias and diversity training is an absolute must. And this is despite what we currently are hearing from the administration in the White House, which we recently heard is trying to get rid of critical race theory, as well as diversity training for any federal organizations or public institutions. There also needs to be accountability, as I mentioned before. Nothing happens in the dark. It has to be where people can actually call it out and take a look at it and say, hey, what's going on with this? You said by a year from now, you would be doing this. Obviously, you need fundraising. Put your money where your mouth is. If diversity is important to you, you have to fund it. Leadership and administration, everything flows from the top, right? If the president, the provost, the vice presidents are not invested in diversity, then no one under them will be diversity. And speaking of putting money where your mouth is, you need to have, if you want your faculty to think diversity is important, make it part of their PTR portfolio process. If you want the departments to think diversity is important, have funding based upon them meeting diversity goals, right? If they have a certain number of students or a certain number of faculty, or they're doing a certain number of diversity events or equity or inclusion events, tie that to their funding. Then for policing, a lot of schools and students right now are concerned, especially if there's local police stations policing on campus, especially diverse students are a little bit uncomfortable with that. Where is your spending going, as I talked about before? Disaggregation, right? Some schools try to hide their diversity numbers. In particular, if you don't have a lot of Native American, Hispanic, Latino, or Black students, you would just report a diversity number, let's say that includes a lot of Asian students who we know are not historically marginalized or minoritized in engineering, right? So you got to disaggregate and be very honest about how many of each population you have. And once again, you want to avoid tokenism. Tokenism would be you have 5 Black students on campus and they are on every page of your website, right? So it makes it look like you have a lot more students than you actually do. You have to be honest. So I really ended my talk on Black in engineering as well as ways to be anti-racist, but I highly follow me on Twitter, follow Black in Engineering on Twitter, and also to visit our website, blackinengineering.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Berry. If you follow her on Twitter right now, you can see her live tweets of the presidential debate. Now, I'd rather watch your live tweets than watch the actual debate.
Thank you. We're playing bingo tonight. If anybody wants to join in, get your bingo card ready. You get free space in the middle.
I got a couple of bingo cards right here. I think I'm gonna need a couple more to get through it. That was very powerful. Thank you, Dr. Berry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we are now at our Q&A roundtable part of the night, part of the evening. You guys have been submitting questions through the 100 platforms that we're streaming on. Isn't virtual, this virtual world's kind of nice because we can include people from, watching from all different platforms and not just people in-house. All right, so I have a question that I think maybe everybody might have an opinion on, but I'm curious to see if maybe Dr. Frank and Dr. Henschel and Dr. Owen, I feel like this question's directed at you three the best. Is there power in scientists and experts talking to their friends and family about some of these topics? I mean, it can get kind of awkward, but is that really beneficial? And do you think those discussions can actually have an impact?
Yeah. I mean, your friends and your family, I'm sure, recognize that you've got some knowledge. And even if it's the type of family where, you're just one of the people, when you start talking about something related to science and you can point out how science funding has produced science results, which have produced changes in the economy, which have produced either the air that we breathe is better, or new innovations in computing, computing to begin with in our lifetime, right? That has an effect, and people will listen to you. But I would like to hear Bill and Rachel too.
Well, I think absolutely yes, it's important. And I think there's 2 reasons. First, it gives you practice talking about those issues and trying to work your way through explaining them to people who are not scientists. And typically, your mom is probably a little friendlier to talk to than a state legislator. So I always call my mom still when I'm talking about, or when I'm trying to figure out how to explain a complex topic, just to see what she thinks. And then the second reason I think it's important is because it allows you to hopefully have an open conversation about why it is they have certain views that allows you to maybe get some insight into people who disagree with you. And I think that that's an incredibly important thing to have when you're talking about science, is figuring out why somebody is maybe rejecting the science, not just knowing that they are in a category of people who don't believe what they're hearing about scientific results.
Dr. Sullivan, do you have anything to add?
I mean, you definitely want to make the effort, family, friends, and of course, strangers. You might encounter, you probably will encounter some individuals where, it's like you're talking to a brick wall. You know, a lot of friends when COVID first hit asked me, we work on infectious diseases, asked me what they should be doing, what's going to happen. Everyone was freaked out. And I told them what I know, what the data was currently suggesting. And, you know, some of them are like, you know, they asked me for this advice. They asked me what I think. And then they're like, well, I don't think so. And I'm like, okay, how many PhDs do I need in this area for you to believe me? But it's really, you're going to encounter people like this. And I invite other opinions from the people on the panel here. My assessment of that situation is you're wasting your time. And it's best to move to someone who is movable, okay? And spend your effort on those individuals rather than the ones that no matter what you tell them, they are not going to change their minds. And you can usually get a sense of that, I think, after a few interactions. But I always try to make the effort.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. Dr. Frank, we have a question here. What is the biggest argument against saving wetlands in Indiana?
The discussion of that wetlands bill centered around trying to make life easier for our county surveyors and the folks who work on drainage problems. You know, a lot of the landscape was drained in order to make way for farming, and those county drains still exist. And so there's always been kind of a push and pull between you know, wanting to drain land in order to have farming versus the function that wetlands play in the ecosystem and in our hydrology. Yeah, so the folks weren't anti-wetlands so much as trying to do things to make life easier for the county surveyors.
Interesting argument. Thank you, Dr. Frank. Dr. Owen, actually kind of a nice segue. Not really, just kidding. What, you know, Dr. Frank talks about how the biggest, actually it is a good segue. So Dr. Frank mentioned how part of the argument against protecting wetlands was just, you know, it adds workload onto a arguably busy office. And so as much as we want to encourage scientists to reach out to policymakers, I mean, you know, faculty and professors are already under a lot of stress and asked to do a lot of things, you know, outside of their official titles. And so adding, here's another interaction piece that's expected of you in your work seems like a lot. So what can or should scientists do to engage with policymakers that doesn't add another layer of burden or stress? Is something like a fellowship kind of a nice intermediate?
Thanks for the question. So we have, I mentioned that we have the fellows program, but we also have a statewide science network, and it actually arose out of conversations with scientists and them saying, like, we maybe have like an hour a month to dedicate to this, or when something comes up, we're really excited about like engaging, but we don't have time to do take 2 years off to do a fellowship program. And so I think if you're trying to make a career transition, a fellowship program is fantastic, and it's a way to get your foot in the door in the policy world. But we encourage scientists to kind of think about what they're already doing, and try not to, add into their schedule. So if they are already going to their PTA meetings, well, maybe start there, talk with people at your PTA meeting, and that may lead to other people talking about science to other policymakers. And then trying to just kind of look at your schedule, look at the things you're already doing, and try to figure out where you're interacting already with your community and start there. And of course, we're always excited to help scientists figure out how to talk with state or federal policymakers, but we know that not everybody has time for that.
For sure. Thank you, Dr. Owen. I know I've recently participated in my society's Capitol Hill Day, and even a 30-minute meeting with a legislator was a pretty lucky hit. So, you know, it's actually not as much time as you might think, but, you know, something like a fellowship, having someone dedicated to that, you know, seems like really nice. Okay, here's a question for Dr. Berry. What steps can those without institutional power, so for example, students, postdocs, trainees, junior investigators, what can they do to hold institutions accountable and do more than just performative allyship?
I think that there's strength in numbers. That's actually why we started Black in Engineering. When we first started talking, you know, a lot of people were like, I'm the only one at my school, I'm the only one in my department. I don't really feel comfortable speaking to some of these things because depending on the person you're seen as a troublemaker or a complainer, it's like, oh my God, there's that Carlotta talking about diversity again. So one of the things we like to say is that if you can make a community like Black in Engineering, it's kind of like your shield. So when we made these things, we were like, hey, Black in Engineering has a video they'd like to share with the president, or we have a call to action we'd like to share with the American Society of Engineering Education. And now you're not seen as an individual anymore. So we say the same thing if you're an ally on campus, join with those organizations doing the work. We have the National Society of Black Engineers, which is our student organization on campus. So like we've had some allies join that as well. You go and do the work with that group because there is power in numbers, right? And you have this community, so you can say, I represent 100 people over here. This isn't just a problem for me and it needs to be addressed.
Absolutely, thank you. As a student myself, I appreciate the tips. Kind of similar question to Dr. Henschel, actually. Are there ways that we can hold, your talk was mostly focused on legislative records, so voting records, but is there anything we can do to hold unelected officials, so you know, appointed positions accountable based on their pro or anti-science decision-making?
Well, so if you're talking about decision-making about science most of the time now, if you're not talking about use of science, then you're only talking state and federal level. So at that point, you need to either do as Rachel was talking about, and you go meet with the legislators, write letters, write articles that support or provide the underlying information that the public needs to recognize that science is important to support. A lot of times it's helpful if you are going to do it, not to do it alone, but work across different nonprofits or organizations that have similar interests. And then the voices are going to be coming from many people and many different interests, and there's more of a tendency to pay attention.
Awesome. So I'm noticing a theme, power in numbers. We might have more sway than we think. There was a Pew Research study in the fall of 2019 that showed that more people knew medical doctor, more Americans knew a medical doctor than knew a PhD level researcher. And I had to laugh when I read that because, well, we're all friends with each other. So that's probably why most people don't seem to be friends with us. Well, that sounds bad. Not saying that we don't have friends. But I thought that was interesting because in that same study, they showed that people who did know a scientist trusted science more. So maybe us just being friendly, you know, and reaching out, maybe that, you know, ripple effect might have a bigger impact than we think.
Can I go back to a point that was made earlier?
Absolutely.
When people aren't listening to you, one of the best ways to get people to start listening to you is to start finding a point of mutual agreement. Sometimes it's you both like puppies. I mean, it can be anything, but start with the points of mutual agreement and then build from there.
That's a great point. I think here in Indiana, our mutual agreement is how either great or awful corn is. Corn seems to be the one thing that ties everyone in the Midwest together and unify. I'm getting nods from Iowa. All right. I'm a Florida transplant too, and that was one of the first things that I learned. Corn rules here in the Midwest. I have an interesting question for Dr. Sullivan. So urban areas tend to have more pollution and also tend to have more left-leaning voters. So based on your talk, can we make a correlation that pollution causes left-leaning voters?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So urban like inner city areas tend to have more higher levels of pollution, but they also tend to have left-leaning voters. So can we like correlate that more pollution equals your political leanings? Is there like a relationship there?
No, I don't think that's a reasonable correlation at all, because there's so many confounding variables that fall into the picture. I applaud anybody's attempts who are looking at circumstances and trying to draw a correlation, and maybe I'm missing something here. But I would attribute that to probably greater diversity in those areas as one potential variable that seems to have more weight in how people vote than something like pollution. There's a lot of studies, some of which were alluded to tonight, suggesting that toxins, by virtue of pollution, lead is a really big one. I'm not aware of any correlations to voter preference, but there's clear correlations between those and a variety of diseases, and even behavioral changes. Like lead in particular is associated with a type of brain damage that predisposes people to higher frequencies of violence.
Interesting. I think it was last year at the Day for Science event, we had a whole talk on lead levels in Indianapolis. So if you didn't catch that talk, this is also ties into another local science policy issue here in Indianapolis. So that seems to be about all of our questions. So I just want to take a second. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. You were all wonderful. I do want to plug Indiana Sciences, Books, Booze, and Brains. This Tuesday, October 27th at 6:30, Books, Booze, and Brains will be discussing World War Z with special guest Chad Priest, who is the executive director of the Indiana Red Cross. And if you enjoyed this and want to support more work like this, please consider grabbing a Science Saves or a Reasons Greetings Ugly sweater at indianasciences.org/merch. Or you can just simply donate at indianasciences.org/give to continue to support science outreach and science communication events such as this. And our take-home message: science is involved in policy, and what's the one way you can make your voice heard right now is to go vote. So vote, whether that's absentee, early, in person, however you have to do it, go do it. We want you to vote for the health and future of Hoosiers, and for really the health and wellness of the rest of this country. This election is so important, and we just want you to vote. And we wanted this whole event, I hope, has given you some tools and some research on some of your legislators, their voting records on bills, so that you go into that voting booth informed and empowered. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. Thank you to our speakers for teaching us so much. And we hope to see you soon. The next Day for Science 2021, or at Books, Booze, and Brains next Tuesday here at Indiana Sciences. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.